President Alexandra Hitchki. I want to say it right. Nista nenaskamon nista pixquid neon absisi. Kanaskum teno kakia no temtik. No akomagnak. Tapa mi ask. Ti algonquen sianishna bekanaskumtin. No tainans manto naskumtin. Koske teo maskusis oskunigeno chinia. Southern Saskatchewan, Treaty 4 territory. As well, I say, Jak się masz? A dużo dobro. Dobry dzień. Dobry dzień. So, I spoke a little Cree and a little bit Ukrainian, so I can say I'm a Ukrainian. I just wanted to say a little bit. In Cree, I said I'm very happy to be here. And from a small reservation in southern Saskatchewan called Little Black Bear. And I want to thank the President, Alexander, for that kind introduction. And as well, I acknowledge my good friend, Ambassador Andriy Shevchenko is here, and Hannah, his beautiful wife, and their two beautiful children that we had the great honor of meeting the last few number of years. Those of you may not know, I did grow up on Little Black Bear First Nation. And I didn't go to a residential school. And I didn't go to the day school on Little Black Bear. Indian Affairs had a busing program at that time. And it was an integration of our people, of First Nations people, into the provincial school system. So I went to school in Goodeve, Saskatchewan, from grade 1 to grade 9. And every morning we would hear, oh, dobre den studente. And we would hear, oh, dobre den ponochatoyo. And then our lessons would begin. And that's why I could say that Bopravation and sing at the Ukrainian Christmas carols with the best of them sometimes. And of course, I love Holopchi and Perehe. I share this history in the sense of going to school with the Atemachuks and the Denishuks, Kuzakavich, Milton Issel, the Piastas, the Uristis, all these people, like there was Ukrainian farmers, Russian farmers, there's the Heikerts, the Germans. They were hardworking people. And we shared, we say, a history of coming together as First Nations people and as Ukrainian people. In the sense that when you think back to the history, and in preparation for this, the starvation that your people endured in the 1930s, the genocide. And I thought, you know, how similar is that to our people? The First Nations people were starved with the killing of the buffalo in the prairies. And then the sicknesses that were inflicted upon our people through smallpox. And then the genocide of the residential schools. So there's a similarity of the genocide of our peoples. And then we say there is that shared history. And then now more than ever, how we have a shared future. Because yet here we are as First Nations people, as Ukrainian people, Ukrainian Canadians, as Cree Canadians, but speaking Ukrainian, speaking Cree, that we are still here and we've persevered. And we have much hope to give to our little ones, that we can create a country that's built on respect of these beautiful languages that we share, the beautiful histories that we bring together, and embrace that concept that Canada as a country is stronger because of that diversity. And so here we are. So we have a shared past. More than ever now, we have a shared future. There's no question. Even in the sense, the stories of growing up together, and all these wonderful names, because they're best friends of mine growing up in Goodeve, Saskatchewan. My wife and I, Val, we went to the 100-year anniversary of Goodeve being a small village back in 2009. And there was a parade through town of Goodeve. We had to circle it about 20 times because it's so small, but we kept going in circles with the parade. But it was a huge parade. Huge. It was people from all over. You know, from Ituna, from Hubbard, from Goodeve, from Malville. And then we started talking about how we work together in schools and all my best friends, and I was just home on the weekend. to Little Black Bear. So I was in background, Good Even, Hubbard, Ituna Town area. And always good to come home. But we started talking about some of the old stories long ago of how even, yes, our people shared this suffering. But even on the prairies long ago, and I talked to the Kurczynski family, and Emil Kurczynski and Kirby Kurczynski used to work for the Department of Indian and Northern Affairs as the Regional Director General. Well, their great-grandfather said it this way, that if it wasn't for the First Nations people, their people would not have survived. This is their truth. So I asked, can I share this story, Kirby? He said, go ahead. His great-grandpa and his great-grandma, they were on the prairies, but there was not a lot of housing and everything else. They'd come in to settle and farm. So they had sod huts, but before the winter came, they were living basically in a hole with a buggy board over them. And they were hungry. So it was First Nations people that brought in food, venison, and everything else. And they helped them survive. So when they were the RDG for Indian Affairs, the Regional Director General, we got tons of support. Tons of support. Because we wouldn't be here as Kurczynskis if it was not for First Nations people. And so I share that story about how we have a shared past and a shared future, because even when I was a young boy growing up, how we trade with the local farmers, because we never had cattle, but they did. And so we'd go trade for cream, fresh cream. Oh, that was good over porridge. Fresh cream, trade for deer meat, the Triennials in town. We trade for all these things that we needed. And it was just a symbiotic relationship. Everybody got along. Everybody worked together because we survived together. And so that's what I remember as a little man growing up, little boy growing up on the reserve, going to Good Eve, being bused to Good Eve. And then even transitioning to the Rokishes. The Rokishes were from Hubbard, the next town over from Good Eve. But we became close friends. And of course, the First Nations people from Black Bear would be on the First Nations bus. But when we started making good friends, I don't want to be really, the white little boy on the Indian bus came home with me to the reserve, and then the Indian boy went on the Ukrainian bus over to Hubbard to go to the Rokish farm. So there was already a getting along and an integration back then. So those teachings of peaceful coexistence and respect and getting along have been ingrained with me just growing up. And the Ukrainian people were always close to me, and I close to them. The Triennials and the Bohes, and our principal, Fred Bohe, was every time I'd be on TV, that's one of Good Eve's. And it was, so I have very fond memories. I also want to give a shout out to another good Ukrainian family, friends of ours, John Hritzak and Judy Hritzak. They're not here today, but they live in Windsor now, but they're in Regina. And we'd always go over to their place for supper and dinner, and we'd have a great conversation and dialogue over many events in the world, local, regionally, nationally, even internationally. So I give a shout out to them. I also want to say in the last little while, I also had a great honor of meeting a gentleman named Mustafa. It's his first name, and I don't want to butcher his last name, but he's the leader of the Tartars. Yes. Mustafa. 30 years imprisoned. 30 years in prison for standing up for the rights of his people. Very powerful man. The strength of character, that resiliency. And I met him 2 or 3 years ago, and we asked, how can I, as National Chief or as a First Nations person, help, support in their struggle? How can I help push Canada as a nation state so that there is recognition of their land and territorial integrity and rights of Ukraine as a country? Can we push for more economic sanctions against Russia? What can we do? Even the simple things like Christia, the minister, saying that we will not welcome Russia back into the G7. Well, we totally support that. Totally support that. And so we want to keep pushing. Because as you, and like us, we say we have our own lands, our own laws, our own language, our own people, our own identifiable forms of government. The right to self-government, the right to self-determination. The same with us as First Nations people. And so in Canada, you look at it across Canada, and there's 634 First Nations across Canada. And we're about, I notice your statistics, about 1.3, 1.4 million people. Same with us. There's 203 First Nations in British Columbia, reservations. In Alberta, there's 47. In Saskatchewan, there's 74. In Little Black Bear is one of those 74. In Manitoba, there's 66. In Ontario, there's 134. In la belle province de Québec, there's 47. Mais oui, je parle français un petit peu. Bienvenue à tous. Très important à mes yeux. 47 over there. There's 13 in Nova Scotia. There's 15 in New Brunswick. 2 in Prince Edward Island. 2 in Newfoundland. There's 14 in the Yukon. And there's 28 in the Northwest Territories. 634 First Nations. But over 60 different nations and languages. All distinct, all unique. In the East Coast, you'll have the Mi'kmaq, the Maliseet, the Pasquimawati. Coming over, you'll have the Mohawks, the Anishinaabeg, the Algonquins, the Ojibways. You have the Huron-Wendat. You have there's so many, the Blackfoots, the Dene, the Coast Salish, the Hulkameelam, the Hulkaminam, the Gitxsan, the Wet'suwet'en. In BC, there's 34 languages. And so there's diversity. So even amongst our people, there's diversity. So we're about 1.4 million people. And when we use that word genocide, we don't use it lightly. Because again, the starvation, the residential schools was a genocide of our people. There's no question. But you know what? I say we learn from the past. Even that thing called the Indian Act in 1876 was put in place. It's a federal piece of legislation. We learn from those things. Because even under that Indian Act, you weren't allowed to leave the reserve without a permit until 1951. Couldn't leave the res. If we were farmers, we couldn't sell our grain without a permit. Couldn't cut down trees to sell pickets without a permit. Weren't allowed to a lawyer without a permit in 1951. And then we weren't allowed to vote till 1960, 61. All these things. So we feel that pain of oppression and termination of rights and title to land and territory. So that's why I say we have a shared history, but a common vision as well. And that's what I want to get into. Because I always say, one should always try to leave more hope in a room than when you walked in. And that's what I want to do here today. Because it's all about building a better country here in Canada and supporting the revitalization and rejuvenation of your country, Ukraine, as well. And so, reconciliation. Let's look back in Canada here in 2019. We just finished a federal government election. But in 2015, we talked about reconciliation and how can we go about improving things. Because according to the United Nations Human Development Index, Canada is rated up here 6th in terms of quality of life. But you apply the same indices to First Nations people, we're 63rd. 6th versus 63rd. So this is what needs to be addressed. And this is why I keep coming to groups and everybody in Canada. I try to build bridges because I need your help. I need your help to talk to members of parliament. I need your help to talk to premiers, to convince them to keep investing in education, in healthcare, and potable water, all these social determinants of good health. Keep investing, because then this gap will close. In Canada, we have a skilled labor shortage. We have an aging workforce. While the fastest growing segment of Canada's population are young First Nations men and women. So invest in education and training. Invest in good housing and good access to water. No question, you're going to get huge returns on investment in the future. And I need you to help me, because I'll say it. But of course the national chief will say that. But when the Ukrainian Congress says it, when all these other organizations from universities, other groups say it, it makes sense. And so that's why you keep reaching out. We talked about closing the gap, and I've said it this way before. How many from Saskatchewan here? Hands up. Okay, a few. Good. Alberta. Oh, there's lots. Manitoba? Okay, good. Well, I don't want to go province by province. If I don't say the other provinces, don't feel bad. I'm not trying to leave you out, because I know there's Ontario, Ukrainians all over, right? It's just like Crees. Like behind every tree, there's a Cree. So there's Ukrainian people all over, same with Cree people. But I just wanted to gain a sense, because what happened this last election, 2015, 2019, there were no Liberals elected, right? So it's all blue, okay? I get that. Andrew Scheer's from my riding, Regina Capel, right? In fact, they were fighting over me, both Prime Minister Trudeau and Andrew Scheer. Well, gee, Bellegarde's got my cell phone number. He's got yours? See, I've got to work with all of them, all the people that get elected. And I have to get along with all of them to bring about good policy changes, good legislative changes, and good investments in that budget every year. That's what I have to do. And so I asked to see where everybody was from, just to get an idea. So you don't get mad at me when I say this next statement. That this Liberal government has done more for First Nations people than anybody in the last 50 years. And why I say that is because I look at the facts. I look at the facts. They've invested in boil water advisories. It's coming down from 130 plus down to 57. It's not done yet, but it's moving in the right direction. They invested in $21.4 billion over 7 fiscal years in the social detail, like education, housing, water, infrastructure, all those things. That's 4 Kelowna Accords. That's a good thing. They passed a very important language bill, Bill C-91, for the revitalization and rejuvenation of all those 60-plus languages across Turtle Island, across Canada. That's important, because that's one of those 5 elements, right? Language, land, laws, people, government. Language is so vital to our identity. And we've said that's so key because we do not want the residential schools to win. So language revitalization. And they also passed Bill C-92. What is C-92? Well, because of intergenerational trauma, the effects of the residential schools, because of the genocide, the breakdown of identity, the breakdown of self, the breakdown of community, the breakdown of family, there's so much alcohol and drug abuse amongst our people. There's a breakdown of family, which results in a lot of our little ones being taken away into care. There's 40,000 First Nations children in foster care in the provinces. We need to fix that. Bill C-92, right? And so it's moving in the right way, but we're not done yet. So the theme I always say is maintain momentum. We need to maintain momentum. And so there is progress. So bear with me in this pronunciation. I'm going to try. Yaradi, skazate, sashomi, bachimo, kroki, opravilnomu, napriemku. So we are seeing steps in the right direction. We're trying to see steps in the right direction. And there's more work to do yet. And so, priorities going forward. We issued another document called Honoring Promises to influence the Liberals, the NDP, the Greens, the Conservatives, everybody, this Honoring Promises document. What was the number one issue? Number one issue for all of us. Not only in Canada, but throughout the world. It's climate change, climate destruction. And we can see what's going on in the world. The big winds, the fires, the floods, the storms. The animals are doing different things. There's something going on. And so we need to find the solution to that. And that is not only for Canada. This is for the world. There is only one world. And what I say in Creole, I say, I'm not only referring to us as human beings, the two-leggeds, because we say, when we go to ceremony, we're the least racist people as First Nations people, because we say, well, we don't care if you're black, yellow, pink, or brown, or red. We're the two-leggeds. We're the two-legged tribe. And every day we give thanks to Anutainan Smantu, the Creator. And we acknowledge the one that sits in the east, and in the south, in the west, and the north. And we give thanks to those four thunders for what they do. We give thanks and acknowledge Mother Earth, our mother. We all come from Mother Earth. We give thanks to Father Sky, Grandmother Moon, Grandfather Sun, our relatives, the star peoples. We acknowledge our four-legged brothers and sisters. We'll acknowledge and give thanks to the winged ones that fly, the ones that swim, the ones that crawl. We give knowledge and give thanks to the ones, the male plants, the female plants. And then we say those four grandmother spirits, Nokomoak, grandmothers, look after the water. Rainwater, fresh water, salt water. And then when life comes, what happens? Water breaks. So we're all related in that worldview. We're the two-leggeds. And nobody's going anywhere. So what are we leaving for our children and grandchildren and those yet unborn, we say? That's how we're connected. So that's why we say climate change, climate destruction was the number one issue and priority. And to my relatives in Saskatchewan and Alberta, we feel that pain, oil and gas. We feel those job losses. You just need to see the plan of how we transition to a clean energy, to wind and geothermal and all these other new initiatives, and that there are jobs in the green energy sector. It's hard for anybody to say that, but we need to show you the plan. So there's not so much anger. There's not so much, we're going to pull out of Canada now. I thought, well, don't forget the First Nations people out west, eh? It's like we're all in this together again. And so moving forward, we talked about climate change. Then we talked about restorative justice. Because something is wrong in a system where we're 5% of the population, but 30, 40, some cases 50% of the jails are full. There's just too many people. And so what do we look at? Restorative justice. First Nations law, Creator's law, in addition to common law and civil law. We want to start looking at that. And then we said, here's where we need your help. The UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is a roadmap to reconciliation. Very important. So we need to see that federal legislation come into being to give it legal effect. And there's hope because there's a province in Canada, British Columbia. They just recently introduced two very important pieces of legislation that impact everybody in a very profound way. They introduced a provincial government bill for the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, but they also introduced a bill for the recognition of the genocide to Holodomor. How do I say that? That's the right way, Holodomor. So that's very important. Happened the same week. You see how we're connected as Ukrainians and First Nations? Things are starting to move in a good way. And so that's why we say support's needed, not only for the UN Declaration, but for that legislation as well that's coming up in BC. I also want to say somewhere else we need your support, that 2019 is the international decade in the world of the indigenous peoples' languages of the world. This is our year, sorry. This is 1 year. 2019 is the year. I jumped ahead because we want to lobby for a decade. And that's where I need your help in pushing Canada and other nation states within the United Nations to push for the decade, not just a year for Indigenous peoples' languages. Because I've said our languages in Canada are Canada's national treasures. They're not spoken anywhere else. We don't have a country called Cree, or Nakota, or Mi'kmaq, or Algonquin, or Halkamilam, or Gitsan, our Wet'suwet'en, our Dene. It's here. And so we have to do all we can to bring them back. So 1 year internationally, sure. It's a year of Indigenous languages. We want to lobby for that decade. And that's where we need to help each other. Because I heard earlier talk about how even Ukrainian's not strongly spoken as it used to be 30, 40 years ago. It used to be the number one language, right? Now it's kind of going down. But you can bring it back. You can bring it back. So my friends, my relatives, again, we have a shared past. But more importantly, we've got a shared future together. We are the two-legged tribe. And if you embrace that worldview, you can see we're all in it together. Not only in Canada, but throughout the world. Even in Ukraine. We have to work together to provide that hope for our children and grandchildren. And so I'm very honored to be here. I thank you for listening to my words. I'll say, Дякую and Slavia Ukraini.